We've been talking, or you've been talking in great detail, and thank you very much for that, about Max's ability to manage tires and other things as well, obviously. And it strikes me now the dust has settled. We saw two almost showpiece stints there of how to manage your tires for Max Verstappen in Mexico. One obviously on the mediums, which quickly went away, and he was really lost in terms of being able to do anything about it with the car,
Yeah,
and making that stint last nonetheless as long as he needed to,
yeah.
and then perfectly timing and managing the use of the red tire into the
Yeah.
second half of the race. I mean, what was your take on all that? And can you give us some insight on what Max and Red Bull would have been going through in order to pull off those two stints like that?
Um, I think the key to it was that his pace on the medium as a first stint tyre was actually very, very strong relative to, I suspect, what other people would have been able to achieve. So although it didn't feel good to him, his pace was actually very strong, and that put him in the position to be competitive once he had changed to the soft. Obviously, what that meant was that when he was on the soft at the end of the race, he had the double benefit of being on the fast tyre on a track that the grip level had improved, and his inherent pace was already very strong. So for cars that were actually not quite as quick as him, but were ahead because they were on the softer tyre in the first part, he was able to double the advantage, and that allowed him to come back. He also, because of the position he was in the first part of the race, wasn't really being held up dramatically. I mean, given a clear fight, I think he would have been much closer to Lando. But then again, we don't know what pace Lando could have ultimately driven at if he had been pressed from behind. So that's debatable. But I think it just comes down to the fact that the Red Bull's pace was actually a lot better than I think even they thought it was, to be quite honest. And I think his poor qualifying, relatively speaking, um, made them think that they were in a worse position potentially than they actually were. Um, in terms of how he achieved it, I think that just comes down to his precise driving, and I suspect that the reason why the medium wasn't great was because it was sliding around too much because it had low grip, and so it was overheating. And because Max is extremely good at managing the tyres and managing tyre temperatures, he was the perfect person to get the most out of that tyre, even if to him it felt pretty bad at the time. I think this is the thing, even when he gets in a negative frame of mind, or I'm not saying he was in a very negative frame of mind, but even when he's not happy, you know that he's driving the car exceptionally well. And it turned out once he got onto the soft option with the extra grip on a tyre, that track that had rubbered in a good car, the pace was there to actually see. Whether Oscar, in the same position as you suggested, starting on the mediums, if he had done the same, would have been able to pull off the same feat, I don't really know. I think he might have been. So I think you had a good point when you suggested that McLaren probably should have started Oscar on the same task, because that would have been a much more positive approach to trying to recover from the poor qualifying position. But yeah, I think ultimately Max's overall package, him and the car, was better than qualifying suggested when it came to race pace. But it is interesting, having sort of seen his long run performance on the Friday. He was doing an awful lot of big lifting in the high speed zone, so that was the area he seemed uncomfortable with. But the other thing that I think sometimes we don't notice is that the long run pace on Fridays is often substantially faster than the races are actually run at. And it was always a query I had with our tyre people, in that I didn't understand why we would run at such fast paces. Everybody does, that's the thing. But it doesn't seem, I always questioned the reliability of the numbers that you got from it, because the pace was often too fast. To be fair, I think going back to Mexico, I think the race pace was actually quite strong, and I suspect that's because the track grip did improve significantly, and it was a lot cooler as well, wasn't it, on Sunday relative to Friday? So that would have made some difference, and maybe that was again a factor in Max's performance being closer. But it's not unusual for the pace difference between the different compounds to close up across a weekend, even if the soft tyre degrades less than it did on the Friday. So it's one of the many things that you have to balance when you're planning your strategy, is to, you know, factoring all these things into it. But I think overall they were in pretty decent shape, and they made the best use of it, really.
The other stint, of course, was the red tyre stint for Max, and it was fascinating, I thought, how he approached the first 4 or 5 laps when he knew he had to be pretty careful on how he brought the tires in, as we'd seen from Lando in Austin. Very easy to overuse them early on. And the number of people that said to me afterwards, how did he get the soft tires to work so quickly? He was so quick out of the box. And of course, he was actually looking after them, driving beautifully. And there was a lovely moment when they said to him, well, he said something like, can you give me push mode or something? And they said, no, mode 6 is fine for now, Max. Just lift and coast. Look up. He said, oh, I'm looking after the tires. I just want a bit more power. And
oh, that's right. Yes, yes.
And then they said, okay. And they got to like 5 laps into the stint. They said, okay, go. And it was just like, he would be very good in those first 5 laps. He was not losing time, and that was just a beautiful bit of driving as well.
Absolutely, he completely gets what you have to do with the tires to make them work, which again, not all of the drivers seem to. Even though they've all been driving these tires for a long time, it will have helped that it was the final stint of the race, and so the track grip would have been significantly better. They would have lasted longer, but he still had to manage them really well to get the ultimate performance out of them. But he is so good at that stuff. He just understands how he needs to use them, and I assume this comes down to qualifying as well. When he pulls out these spectacular qualifying laps, I'm sure that's partly because he has very good understanding of how to prepare the tyres on the out lap before doing those spectacular pole laps, because it is all part of it. It's really important, and it's not something that the engineers can necessarily help with beyond a certain point. There's a certain amount of information that you can give. There's a certain amount of analysis that can be done leading up to qualifying as to how best to prepare the tyres, but there is nothing to beat the driver's ultimate feel. And he will have used all his runs leading up to qualifying and during qualifying up to that last run in Q3 to hone his preparation for those laps. So he just is the complete package when it comes to tyre prep, I would say.